So this is fair warning. This is not a linear dialogue. For some reason, I talk in orbits, so I promise I'll get you to where we are at Starfish. It was one of those over-caffeinated decisions to call it this, but I'll get you there. So I wrote a thesis, a master's thesis, and when you start out on a thesis journey, people assume you know exactly what you're going to do, what question you're going to answer, and that you have the whole thing mapped out. Sometimes they ask you for the answer to the question before you even conducted the research. They assume you're following the right path, that you're organized, detailed, methodical, disciplined, and highly caffeinated. It's kind of like the perfect canoe trip. My lived thesis experience, however, felt like I was dropped in the middle of the night into an unknown lands during a hurricane and hurtled down a river backwards in a canoe as I tried to scramble for the paddle. Thankfully, my thesis journey was highly caffeinated. As a result, I eventually wrote a master's thesis. It's now a book over there on the table. The research explores how adult recreational canoeists develop a sense of place through their experiential learning of place at the intersection of story and artifact. Coincidentally, I had an artifact in my bag, thanks to Lynn Ward, the fabulous Lynn Ward. It's a little heart-shaped stone that I picked up she gave to me just before I embarked on a Keel River trip in the Northwest Territories. And that's the embodied holding of objects, and how do we tell place-based stories around those objects, the embodied experiences of place. And this work, it really explores how canoeists' sense of place has impact and informed, really shaped how they make their ecological choices and how they identify with their local places and the places they've traveled, similar to, I think, the landowners that Walter's just spoken about. Really, it's just a canoe trip story. It's set on the Mississauga River, which is a route I traveled a couple pairs of years ago. And this is not a research talk. So I want to get good and gritty. I want to get granular about canoe trip storytelling. I wrote a narrative. It's a fictional narrative with real stories inside of it. And the reason I want to do this is I want to see how this might impact and play out in an environmental way. For many of you, I know this will be as clear as a bluebird day, and I think that I'm speaking to people who are already in their hearts nodding. Yeah, this is important. We've heard this already. There's a lot of work being done environmentally. So my book, yes, called Paddling is Place, and so I'm not going to talk about all of it. I'm just going to pull one little thread that came out and talk a little bit about what this means and how our stories make subtle and powerful changes. A long time ago, I heard a parable, and I wonder if you know it too. A big storm once washed up hundreds and hundreds of starfish onto a beach. Early the next morning, a young child, an old man walked that beach. For a while, the old man watched as the young child walked along and picked up the starfish and one by one tossed them back into the ocean. After some time of watching the child, the old man came over. He asked, "Son, why are you bothering? Why are you bothering to throw those starfish back into the ocean? Look at them," and he gestures with his walking stick. "You're never going to be able to do it all. It's not really going to matter." The young child looked at the hundreds of starfish, and then down at the one in his hand, and then back up at the old man. And the child said, "I think it matters to this one." And he threw it back into the ocean. Soon after I heard this little story, I tucked it away somewhere into the dusty and eclectic recesses of my brain, and I never thought about it again. Of course, until I did. It was in the mid-slog during my master's, a smoggy Toronto summer, and those of you who live in Toronto, yes, you know these ones. I was riding a really bad, beat-up bicycle around the city, and I was always carrying far too many books that I had to read. During our ecological identity course, we were asked to consider how do we relate to the natural environments we are in? How do we identify community? Where is our environmentalism rooted? And we were asked to describe ourselves politically as to where do you rest on the environmental spectrum? Ever a fence walker, very diplomatic in a lot of things I do, I was really, really intimidated by this last question. I was also much more worried about how paltry my answer would really sound. Living environmentally for me has never meant that I've carried picket signs or I've been able to make huge donations to really important causes. I've never written long letters to the government. I've never chained myself in those really awesome ways that people do that to logging equipment or to something that they really feel passionate about. And, I have often sat very uncomfortably with that. Compared to these tremendously impassioned, intelligent, remarkable environmental leaders, I am a bit beige. I just don't know how it would rest. And then I reflected and I thought, well, I do try and make some differences. I bike, I choose not to own a car, I keep my house at a lower temperature, I recycle water, I'm a gardener, and I have a tiny little pocket garden out front of my house that gives me enormous joy even now. And when I'm out there, the children will stop and they'll say, "What are you doing?" Because everyone else has got lawns or parking pads. "Oh, I'm gardening." "Why?" "Because I love it." "What's that?" "It's a weed." "How do you know?" And then we start a conversation. And those little conversations are ways that these little actions brought me back to that starfish. That maybe the way I start being an environmentalist is where it's at the easiest places. So, having discovered that this is what it is, I told my classmates, "Hey, I'm a starfish environmentalist." And then, of course, I had to explain what that meant. For the record, this is not necessarily about saving starfish specifically, as magical as these wonderful creatures truly are. This is about deciding to take little actions in the face of tremendous and seemingly overwhelming odds. This past fall, some researchers from the University of Toronto, in collaboration with colleagues from the University of Waterloo, they published an article. It was titled "Haters: Why People Shun Environmentalists, Feminists, and Other Activists." The research investigated the trend that even when people support the goals of environmentalism, they don't want to be associated with the activists promoting this cause. It's a little uncomfortable and a little awkward. How are we going to get this fixed? The researchers attribute this in part to activist labels such as militant or unhygienic, eccentric. Even words like granola and tree hugger, which I'm sure we've all slung around at some point in time, they seem to evoke a brand label about what it means to be eco-conscious. In addition, the enthusiasm with which some environmentalists sort of take action, those ones that we often hear about in the news, it kind of deters people from taking further action themselves. And sadly, sometimes these results mean that individuals will actually intentionally not take action. This perplexes me, because on the global and in political landscape of environmental discourse, just recently, President Obama, during the recent State of the Union address, paused dramatically. He looked straight in the camera, and he said, "Climate change is a fact." Climate change doesn't need the President of the United States of America to tell us that. You can look at the birds in Algonquin Park, the vanishing icebergs that will no longer come down from the north. But what that does is lend significant political weight to something we have all seen, we have all experienced in the intimate ways we experience wilderness places. So suddenly, I realized we have to stop debating about whether it exists and realize that there's something more important happening here. And it's heavy, and it made me feel like I'm back on that beach, staring at hundreds, if not thousands, of starfish washed up after a storm. The sun has risen, and they're starting to dry and wither. Their gorgeous colors are fading. And an old man just showed up to tell me that the problem is bigger than I can possibly ever solve. So what do? I started the stories. Narrative, or storytelling, has become something of a sexy methodology in research. I personally love it because it kind of pisses off the academics. It's like, it's very qualitative, I don't know what to do with that. When I'm looking at storytelling, I'm not trying to literally build bridges. We're creating pathways. And with storytelling, there's a lot of things when you're telling your stories that you're doing. I started making a list. This is not definitive or inclusive and certainly not scientific, but here's the list. When you tell your stories, you're entertaining those hard-slogging, muddy, mosquito-ridden portages. You fill in time while you're poking the fire. You're reaching out to your fellow trippers. You create vulnerability. You create safety. You unpack your value systems and tell us what truly matters to you. You invite others to connect with you, therefore also creating community. You're trying to make sense of the ineffable. You're challenging the concept that only things that can be counted are the only things that truly matter. And you're weaving onto the landscape a verbal thread of your own past places, and you're embedding them into those current places. You create and recreate your own identities through a pattern of reflecting back through your experiences. You're looking for ways they're unfolding into this current one. And what you're doing when you're telling your stories is you're cracking open in a space where others can come and share their stories, and where they can place and understand and unpack their own understanding. For a few years now, I've often thought that stories act like those little brown burrs, you know, the ones when you're walking through fall fields that hook themselves onto your wool sweaters and your wool socks. Those little brown burrs, they have little hooks, and each of those little sensory experiences of a story then attach themselves to somebody else and give them sort of a sticky opportunity to also connect with what you have to say. You create resonance. Mitchell Thomas Show, who is one of the theorists, practitioners who underpins a lot of the research that I've done, he talks about place-based experiences, and we've heard about each of those. We've heard about childhood places. We've heard about disrupted and damaged places. And we've heard a lot about wilderness places. And for all of us here, we continue to see how powerful and moving, how phenomenal our experiences in the wilderness can truly be. Typically, our wilderness travels bring us into direct and intimate contact with the natural world, and through our embodied experiences, we absorb the tacit, implicit land-based learning, and it's there because we're there. And tripping can also allow us a sacred, quiet time, just staring quietly at the world around us. As one of my research participants said, you just really can't put words to it. Yet here we are, in the depths of a full Canadian winter, putting words to our wilderness experiences. And we're doing this as a part of a reflexive practice then that helps us better understand ourselves. And within the broader context of our landscape, by listening, we're seeking resonance with each other. Perhaps this approach to engaging in environmental dialogue might be one of the keys to engaging with others. It might be a way for them to consider how they may also increase their own environmental actions. By sharing stories, we kind of sidle up beside someone instead of standing in front of them and saying, you need to do this. It's nothing better to create resistance than something to lean up against it. But instead, when you walk a path beside someone, when you say, this is my understanding of my experience, and it made me feel uncomfortable, and I made this change, I wonder, what is yours? When we act in that particular way, that reflexive practice, we ask them to also consider how their own nature stories may then help us learn something new as well. I agree it's a much more mild approach. Storytelling isn't going to stop all the starfish from dying on the beach. But I think if we understand that because we have opposable thumbs and because we have these amazing brains, we are engaging and sharing our stories. I wonder if we more intentionally consider where there is opportunities to also ask others to do the same, maybe then we might be able to teach or reflect on how we can be a new way in our natural world. In a political ecoscape where people are really wobbling under the weight of too much to do to save the earth, and where we try and step away from the leading environmentalists, maybe because of guilt or we don't want to look like a tree hugger, then suddenly we have to think about where's the softer place to enter into environmental action. I suspect every single one of you here is already there. But where are the people who are not in this audience? Where are they in their own practices? And maybe I wonder, if we ask people to think about little changes, maybe those little changes will turn into more little changes, which may actually turn into bigger acts of change. Of course we need strong environmental leaders, and we need everyone's actions, not for those of just a determined few. In your acts of storytelling, you are making changes. The shifts are as subtle as a few rocks shifting under your feet, but by intentionally engaging in these stories, you're creating a place of listening. Place-based narratives have a powerful effect on people. Everything happens somewhere, a writing professor once told me, and in some ways, place is a character in our own lives. Because we humans weave our own personal stories inside of those places, our own understandings are attached there, we're turning our places into teachers in some sort of way. In each little story, and in each wildly exaggerated one, and I'm sure none of them here tonight have been exaggerated, in each of those you're holding a little starfish. And when you choose to make meaning of this story and share that meaning and share that story with another, you're making a difference, even if it is just with one little starfish. And in that action, you are making bigger choices too. So, I want to thank you for sharing your stories, and I want to thank you for listening to mine.